The helicopters arrived on a Tuesday morning, and by noon, the whole town had a theory. Nobody thought to ask Daniel Pruitt. He was the one who bought the sink. He was the one they'd been quietly laughing about for 7 months. He stood at the fence line in the same canvas jacket he wore to work, watching the survey crew unload equipment worth more than anything in Harlow County. And he didn't say a word. The helicopters weren't a surprise. The surveyors weren't a surprise. The only thing that surprised him, if he was honest, was how long it had taken. He had known what was under that ground before he signed a single document. He had known before the listing agent shook his hand with that particular smile, the one people use when they think they're doing you a favor. He had known before the neighbor's quote ran in the county paper, before the clerk at the agricultural office explained, slowly, what the word backlog meant. 61 acres of rock and bad drainage, and a creek nobody wanted the rights to. He had paid $48,000 for it. He watched Dr. Renata Voss step off the second helicopter and scan the ridgeline with the focused patience of someone who already knew what she was going to find. Then he turned and walked back to the house to make his daughter's lunch. Daniel Pruitt was not a man who explained himself. It was not stubbornness, and it was not shyness. It was something closer to economy, a learned preference for using words only when they were strictly necessary, developed over 15 years of working in places where the land itself did the talking and human opinion was mostly noise. He had spent those 15 years as a senior hydrogeologist for Meridian Energy Group, reading subsurface formations across 4 continents. He could look at a ridgeline and tell you what was underneath it, the way a Papuan experienced carpenter looks at a wall and knows immediately where the studs are. It was pattern recognition built from 10,000 hours of being wrong, and then right, and then wrong again, until the errors burned off, and what remained was something close to instinct. He had published 3 internal technical analyses that his supervisors had quietly used to redirect drilling programs worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His name appeared in the acknowledgments. The redirected programs appeared in the quarterly reports. That was the arrangement, and for a long time he had accepted it without complaint, because the work itself was enough. Then his wife, Claire, got sick, and then she was gone, and then the traveling, which had always been the cost of the work, became a cost he could no longer calculate. He handed in his access badge on a Wednesday morning, drove 12 hours back to the rural edge of Harlow County, where Claire's mother still lived, and rented a 2-bedroom house with a porch thermometer and a yard that needed cutting. Maisie was 3 years old. She did not understand what had happened to her mother. She understood that her father was there every morning when she woke up, and for a long time, that was the only arithmetic that mattered. Maisie was 8 now. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's habit of observing things carefully before commenting on them, which meant that for a child, she was unusually good company. Every morning before school, she climbed off the porch step, walked to the thermometer nailed to the post beside the railing, studied it for a moment, and announced the temperature in a clear voice, as if completing an official duty. 51 degrees, 38 degrees, 64 degrees, and probably going up. She said it to the yard, to the fence line, to no one in particular, and then she went inside and ate her toast. Daniel had never asked her why she did it. He understood that some routines did not require explanation. They simply marked the day as started. She carried a stuffed rabbit named Clover everywhere that was not school. Clover had been brown once. Now clover was a color that existed only in the taxonomy of loved things, somewhere between gray and the memory of brown. One ear had been restitched twice. Maisie did not treat Clover as a toy. She treated Clover as a colleague. Their life in Harlow County was quiet, in the way that lives become quiet when they have been organized around a loss. Daniel worked 4 days a week at Tanner Equipment Rental on Route 9, checking machinery in and out, running the occasional delivery. He cooked dinner most nights. He helped Maisie with her reading. On weekends he walked. He walked the county roads and the field edges and the creek banks the way he had once walked survey sites, not for exercise but to look. Old habits do not dissolve. They simply find new terrain. It was on one of those walks, 18 months before the helicopters came, that he had first seen the ridgeline on the eastern boundary of the sink. He had stopped walking without deciding to stop. The formation was subtle. A particular way the ground lifted and then leveled, the specific angle of exposed rock at the creek bank, the way the seasonal drainage ran counter to what the topography suggested on a casual read. He stood there for 11 minutes. He knew because he checked his watch when he started, and again when he moved. Then he went home and opened his old company laptop and found the subsurface analysis he had run in 2009 on a Meridian survey parcel 4 miles east. He had printed the relevant pages that night on the inkjet printer in the hallway and folded them twice and put them in the inside pocket of his canvas jacket. The sink had been listed for 14 months by then. It had started at $74,000. It was down to $61,000 and falling. 61 acres of floodplain rock bisected by a creek that ran hard in March and barely at all by August. 3 different buyers had walked away after inspection. The listing described it as a property with potential and left the potential unspecified, which is what listing agents write when they have run out of honest things to say. Daniel called the listing agent on a Thursday afternoon and made a cash offer of $48,000. The agent's name was Gary Sells. He had been selling rural property in Harlow County for 22 years, and in those 22 years, he had developed a reliable ability to identify buyers who did not fully understand what they were purchasing. He identified Daniel immediately. He accepted the offer with a warmth that contained, below its surface, a kind of pity, the particular pity of a man who believes he is doing a fool, a kindness, by not talking him out of his own decision. He shook Daniel's hand at closing with both of his, which was something he did when he felt guilty. Daniel did not explain himself. He signed the documents, took the keys to the equipment shed, and drove home. That evening, Maisie sat across from him at the kitchen table, with Clover propped against the fruit bowl, and asked if they were going to move to the farm. Daniel said not yet. She asked if the farm had animals. He said, not currently. She considered this, and then asked if Clover counted. Daniel said he supposed Clover counted. She seemed satisfied with that, and went back to her drawing. On the inside pocket of his jacket, folded into a neat rectangle, and soft at the creases from being handled, the 2009 survey data waited in the quiet way that true things wait, without urgency, without announcement, with complete patience for the moment the world caught up. The quote ran on a Thursday in the Harlow County Gazette, buried in the agricultural notes section between a announcement about the Winter Wheat Cooperative and a notice regarding road resurfacing on County Road 7. It was 8 words from a man named Burl Mackey, who ran 400 acres of cattle pasture on the western boundary of the sink and had watched the property sit empty for 14 months, with the particular satisfaction of a man who considers a neighbor's failure to be a form of companionship. Paid good money to grow rocks, Burl had said. His name ran under it. Daniel read it at the kitchen table on Friday morning while Maisie ate her toast. He read it once, folded the paper, and set it beside his coffee cup. Maisie looked at the paper, and then at her father's face, and then back at her toast. She had learned early to read the difference between her father being quiet and her father being still. This was stillness. She finished her toast and announced that it was 43 degrees, probably not going up much, and went to get her backpack. Daniel did not cancel his subscription to the Gazette. He did not call Burl Mackey. He drove to work and checked in a tractor attachment, and checked out a soil auger, and ate his lunch in the cab of the delivery truck with the window down, watching a red-tailed hawk work a fence line 3 fields over, and said nothing to anyone about any of it. The first dismissal had come earlier, before the ink was dry on the closing documents, before he had even turned the key in the equipment shed lock for the first time. Gary Sells had made his feelings known not through any single statement, but through the specific choreography of the closing meeting, the way he had positioned himself slightly closer to the title officer than to Daniel, the way he had explained each document with a fraction more care than was necessary, as though simplifying for someone who might not follow the language. Daniel had watched him do it with the same detached attention he applied to everything, the way a naturalist observes a bird displaying without taking it personally. After the signing, Gary had walked him to his truck and said, in the tone of a man wrapping a gift he knows will be returned, "Well, Daniel, I hope it becomes everything you're hoping for." The pause before everything was small but precise. It meant, "which I doubt it will." Daniel had thanked him and driven away, and Gary had stood in the parking lot watching the truck until it turned the corner, already composing, without knowing it, his version of the story he would tell for years about the quiet man who bought the sink. The Gazette quote was the second dismissal. The third arrived 6 weeks later, in a fluorescent-lit office on the second floor of the Harlow County Municipal Building, from a clerk named Patrice Holden, who had worked in the agricultural office for 11 years and had developed, in that time, a comprehensive map of which requests were worth processing and which were not. Daniel had filed an application to formally document and register the senior water rights attached to the seasonal creek that bisected his property. The rights were real. They predated the county's irrigation district by 60 years, which meant they sat above the district's claims in every legal hierarchy that mattered. He had found the original deed language on his third visit to the county records room, copied it by hand into a small notebook, and cross-referenced it against the State Water Board's historical registry. The claim was sound. It was better than sound. It was, in the technical vocabulary of water rights law, airtight. Patrice Holden had looked at his application for approximately 4 seconds. She had then looked at Daniel over the tops of her reading glasses, with the expression of someone who has seen many versions of this particular conversation and found none of them productive. She said that the office was currently running a 14-week backlog on non-urgent filings. She said that historical claims of this nature required supplementary documentation that his application did not include, and handed him a 2-page checklist. She said, and this was the part Daniel turned over quietly in his mind on the drive home, that those old claims don't really mean anything anymore. She said it the way people say things they believe absolutely, which is to say, without thinking about them at all. Daniel took the checklist. He thanked her. He walked down the fluorescent stairwell and out into the gray November afternoon, and sat in his truck for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel, not gripping it, just resting there. Then he drove to the sink, parked at the equipment shed, and walked the creek bank for 40 minutes in the cold, reading the water. That evening he made chicken and rice for dinner. Maisie sat across from him with Clover and reported that it had dropped to 31 degrees and that the puddle at the end of the driveway had a skin of ice on it that she had broken with her shoe. Daniel asked how thick. She said about as thick as a cracker. He nodded and served her plate. After dinner, she did her reading homework at the table while he washed up, and at some point, without discussion, she climbed down from her chair, came and stood beside him at the sink, and leaned her head against his arm for a moment, before going to brush her teeth. She did not say anything. She was 8. She understood the geometry of comfort without knowing the word for it. In the weeks that followed, Daniel worked the property on weekends. He cleared drainage channels. He repaired the equipment shed roof with lumber. He bought second-hand from a salvage yard. He walked every boundary line with a measuring wheel. He took soil samples from 11 locations and sent them to an agricultural lab under a business name he had registered for $45 online. He continued to carry the folded survey pages in the inside pocket of his canvas jacket, not because he needed to refer to them, but because they were a kind of ballast, a physical record of the reasoning that had brought him here, something to press his hand against from the outside when the county clerk's voice came back to him in the quiet. Those old claims don't really mean anything anymore. He had heard variations of that sentence his entire professional life, applied to data that inconvenienced people, to findings that required expensive recalibration, to survey results that made things more complicated than the people in charge wanted them to be. He had learned that sentences like that one were not statements about truth. They were statements about preference. The ground did not care about anyone's preference. The formation under the sink had been there for 40 million years. It would be there after every opinion in Harlow County had long since dissolved. He kept working. He said nothing. He waited for the world to catch up. Dr. Renata Voss arrived on a Wednesday morning in early April, driving a white pickup truck with Texas plates, 40 minutes ahead of the helicopter crew she had sent on ahead. Daniel was in the equipment shed, sharpening a fence post driver, when he heard the truck on the gravel. He set the file down, wiped his hands on a rag, and walked to the shed door. She was already out of the truck by the time he reached it. She was perhaps 50, with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of posture that comes from spending decades in the field rather than behind a desk. Straight not from discipline, but from habit. The body of someone accustomed to standing on uneven ground and making accurate observations anyway. She wore work boots that had been resoled at least once. She carried a battered aluminum field case in her left hand and a folded set of documents in her right. She looked at the ridgeline before she looked at Daniel. When she turned to him, she did not smile the way Gary Sells had smiled. She said, "Are you Daniel Pruitt?" He said he was. She said, "I'm Renata Voss. I run subsurface assessment for Crail Land and Mineral out of Houston. I read your 2009 Meridian survey on the Eastfield parcel. The basin modeling in Section 4 was the best regional subsurface analysis I've seen from that period." She paused. "I've been watching this property for 2 years. I wanted to see if anyone with the right eyes would buy it." Daniel looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You want coffee?" She said she did. They sat at the small table in the equipment shed with 2 mugs and her aluminum field case open between them, and for the first time in 7 months, Daniel Pruitt talked about what was under his land. Not because he needed to establish anything, but because Renata Voss asked precise questions and deserved precise answers, and the pleasure of speaking technically to someone technically fluent was something he had gone without long enough that he felt it physically, a kind of unlocking, a pressure releasing from somewhere behind the sternum. She walked him through what her preliminary remote sensing data showed. He walked her through the 2009 basin analysis and the specific indicators he had identified in the ridge formation, the way the surface anticline tracked northeast along the creek drainage, the pressure signature consistent with a stratigraphic trap at depth, the permeability indicators in the exposed creek bank rock that suggested a connected formation rather than an isolated pocket. He spread the folded survey pages on the table between them, soft at the creases, the ink slightly faded from months in his jacket pocket. Renata looked at the pages for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "You've been carrying these since before you bought it." It was not a question. Daniel said yes. She nodded once, the way people nod when something confirms what they already suspected, and closed the field case. The helicopter crew arrived 20 minutes later, 4 technicians with a ground-penetrating radar array and a magnetometer system that Daniel recognized as a configuration used for deep formation mapping rather than shallow utility detection. Professional grade. The kind of equipment that did not get deployed on uncertain prospects. They began setting up along the eastern boundary with the methodical efficiency of people who had done this specific sequence many times before. Maisie arrived at the property at 3:30, delivered by the school bus that stopped at the end of the access road. On days Daniel left her a note with the bus driver. She came through the gate with her backpack on and Clover tucked under one arm, and she stopped when she saw the helicopters parked in the upper field and the technicians moving along the ridge with equipment she had no category for. She walked to where Daniel stood with Renata at the fence line and looked at the helicopters for a moment, then up at her father. "Those are big," she said. Daniel said they were. She looked at Renata with the careful, unhurried assessment that was her default approach to new people. Renata looked back at her with equivalent seriousness. "Is Clover a rabbit?" Renata asked. Maisie said yes, and that Clover's ear had been fixed twice, but was holding fine now. Renata said that was good engineering. Maisie considered this and appeared to agree. The data collection ran through the afternoon and into the early evening. Daniel walked sections of the survey grid with the lead technician, a young man named Forsyth, who had the efficient, incurious manner of someone comfortable operating excellent equipment without needing to understand everything it implied. At the eastern boundary, where the ridge formation dropped toward the creek bank, Forsyth paused the array and looked at his screen for a moment, then looked at the ground, then back at his screen. He said, "Mr. Pruitt, what's your read on the trap geometry here?" Daniel crouched and looked at the exposed strata in the creek bank, the slight angular unconformity where the sandstone layer met the overlying shale, the way the bedding tilted just enough to suggest structural closure beneath. He indicated the contact line with one finger, tracing it along the bank face without touching the rock. He said, "Structural trap, probably with a stratigraphic component along this contact. The closure's deeper than the surface expression suggests. My estimate from the 2009 data was 200 meters minimum." Forsyth looked at his screen again. He was quiet for a moment. Then he set his clipboard down on top of the array housing with a deliberateness that was itself a kind of response. The unconscious gesture of a man who needs his hands free to recalibrate what he is thinking. He said, "That's consistent with what we're seeing." He did not say anything else. He picked up his clipboard and continued the survey, but he did not ask Daniel to move back from the equipment after that. He angled the screen slightly so Daniel could see the returns as they came in. By the time the light started going, Renata had walked the full perimeter of the property twice. She stood at the gate with Daniel while her crew broke down the array, and she was quiet in the way that people are quiet when they are running numbers they have not yet finished running. She said, "I'll need to file the formal assessment with our acquisition team. That takes 10 days, but I want to be honest with you about what we're looking at." Daniel waited. She said, "The mineral formation is significant. The water rights are going to complicate the county irrigation district in ways that are going to require legal attention, which means they're worth considerably more than anyone in this county currently understands." She paused. "You knew both of those things when you bought this property?" Daniel said yes. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite admiration and not quite relief. Something between them. Something that belonged specifically to one expert recognizing another after a long time of not finding them. She said, "The 2009 analysis. That was your work, not Meridian's." Daniel said Meridian's name was on the cover page. She said, "I know whose name was on the cover page." The crew loaded the last of the equipment into the trucks. The helicopters lifted in sequence, angling south into the last of the light. Maisie stood beside Daniel at the fence line, with Clover under her arm, and watched them go. She said, "Dad, did they find what you thought they'd find?" Daniel looked at the ridgeline, where the formation ran northeast, beneath 61 acres of rock and bad drainage, and a creek nobody had wanted the rights to. He said, "Pretty much." Maisie nodded seriously, as if filing a report, and went to check the temperature on the equipment shed thermometer. The 10 days Renata had mentioned became 12, then 14. Daniel did not call. He had given her his number, and she had given him hers, and that was the full extent of what needed to happen next. He understood how acquisition processes worked. He understood that the delay was not doubt, it was procedure, the slow institutional machinery that had to catch up to what two people standing at a fence line already knew. He understood all of that in the part of his mind that was still the senior hydrogeologist who had navigated Meridian's internal bureaucracy for 15 years. The other part of him sat alone in the equipment shed at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, 2 weeks after the helicopters, with a bill from the county agricultural office on the workbench in front of him. It was not a large bill. It was a processing fee for the supplementary water rights documentation he had finally submitted, the full package Patrice Holden's checklist had required, assembled over 3 weeks of evenings after Maisie was in bed. $45, the kind of amount that should have meant nothing. He had been carrying it in his jacket pocket for 4 days without opening it, and now it sat under the workbench light, and the number on it was not the point. The point was the line below the payment amount, printed in the flat administrative language of a system that processed everything the same way, regardless of what it contained. Claim status, under review. No determination of validity has been made at this time. He had submitted 60 pages of documentation, historical deed language, State Water Board registry records, hydrological survey data, a legal brief he had written himself at the kitchen table between 9 and midnight over the course of 2 weeks, citing 14 precedents, cross-referenced and footnoted. He had done the work of a water rights attorney without billing anyone for it, and the county's response was 11 words that meant nothing had changed yet. He set the bill down. He picked up a wrench from the bench and held it without using it, turning it over in his hand the way he sometimes turned things over in his mind. Not restless, just present, feeling the weight of it. The shed smelled of machine oil and cold concrete, and the faint mineral smell of the creek that came through the gap under the door when the wind was right. Outside, the property was dark and quiet. The ridgeline he could not see but knew was there. He thought about Claire, not in the way grief arrives when it is still sharp. That was years behind him now, worn smooth by daily life, the way creek rock loses its edges. He thought about her the way he thought about her most often now, which was sideways, obliquely, through the specific texture of a moment she would have recognized. She had been a woman who understood patience, in the way that Daniel understood geology, not as waiting for something to happen, but as the accurate recognition that some processes cannot be hurried, and that the only rational response to that fact is to continue working. She would have understood why he was sitting in a cold equipment shed at 11 at night, holding a wrench he wasn't using, and she would not have said anything about it, and her not saying anything would have been its own specific comfort. He set the wrench down. He pulled the folded survey pages from his jacket pocket and smoothed them open on the workbench. He did not need to read them. He had read them enough times that the relevant figures lived in him now, as familiar as his daughter's face. He looked at them anyway. The basin cross-section he had drafted by hand in 2009, the formation depth estimates, the pressure gradient calculations that had taken him 4 days to run, and that his supervisor had incorporated into a drilling program recommendation, without once asking how Daniel had arrived at the numbers. He folded them back along the same creases, returned them to his pocket. He thought about the clerk's voice. Those old claims don't really mean anything anymore. He thought about Gary Sells's two-handed handshake. He thought about 8 words in the agricultural notes section of the Harlow County Gazette. None of it was cruelty. That was the thing he had come to understand about this particular kind of dismissal. It was not malicious. It was simply the natural behavior of a world that had decided, without examining the evidence, that a quiet man working a part-time job at an equipment rental yard had nothing worth looking at closely. The world was not wrong to have rules of thumb. Rules of thumb were efficient. They were also, occasionally, catastrophically wrong, and the cost of that wrongness was borne entirely by the person the rule of thumb had failed to see. He stood up. He turned off the workbench light. He walked across the dark property to the truck, drove the 20 minutes home, and went inside. Maisie's door was open the way she liked it. He stood in the hallway for a moment and listened to her breathing, steady, unhurried, the breathing of a child who had checked the temperature and filed her report and found the world in acceptable order. Clover was visible in the dim light from the hallway, propped against the pillow beside her, one repaired ear upright. Daniel went to the kitchen. He set the county bill on the table. He put the kettle on. Then he sat down and opened his laptop and began drafting the response to the county's determination notice that he had known, since the moment he walked out of Patrice Holden's office, he was eventually going to have to write. He worked until 2 in the morning. Then he went to bed. The formal acquisition offer arrived on a Tuesday morning, 16 days after the survey, in a document package delivered by a courier who required a signature and who stood at the equipment shed door with the particular blank professionalism of someone who had no idea what he was carrying. Daniel signed for it. He set it on the workbench. He finished replacing the hydraulic fitting he had been working on, wiped his hands and opened it. The cover letter was 2 pages. Renata had written it herself. He recognized the precision of the language, the absence of unnecessary cushioning. The mineral rights acquisition offer from Crail Land and Mineral Group was $4.1 million, structured as an upfront payment with a production royalty attached. The water rights, assessed separately by a Houston-based water law firm that Crail had retained, carried an independent valuation of $900,000, a figure that reflected not their current use, but their legal supremacy over the county irrigation district's claims, which the firm's assessment described, in language that was both technical and quietly devastating, as subordinate in every applicable jurisdiction. Combined value, just under $5 million. For 61 acres of rock and bad drainage, and a creek nobody had wanted the rights to. For $48,000, paid in cash to a man who shook hands with both of his. Daniel read the cover letter twice. Then he folded it precisely and put it in his jacket pocket, on top of the survey pages, and drove home to get Maisie. Crail's formal presentation to the County Water Board took place 3 weeks later in the Harlow County Municipal Building. The same building, 2 floors below the Agricultural Office, where Patrice Holden had explained what the word backlog meant. The hearing room held 40 people. It held 53 that morning. Word had moved through the county the way word moves in small places. Not announced, simply known, arriving in the specific register of something that changes the story a town has been telling about itself. Daniel sat in the second row, with Maisie beside him. She had Clover on her lap and was wearing the blue cardigan she wore for things she understood to be important, without being told they were important. She had announced that morning, at the porch thermometer, that it was 58 degrees and felt like it was going up. She had said it with her usual authority and gone inside for her toast, and Daniel had stood on the porch for a moment after she went in, looking at the sky, which was clear and pale and indifferent and correct. Renata Voss presented the subsurface assessment findings in the flat, precise language of someone who has learned that technical fact requires no rhetorical assistance. She displayed the formation mapping data on a screen at the front of the room. She displayed the water rights historical registry documentation. She presented the legal analysis of the creek claim's priority status. She was thorough and unhurried, and she did not editorialize. At the point in the presentation where she cited the foundational subsurface analysis that had identified the formation's viability, she said, "The basin modeling that first established the formation characteristics of this parcel was conducted in 2009 by a Meridian Energy Group hydrogeologist named Daniel Pruitt, whose analysis correctly predicted the trap geometry, the depth of closure, and the pressure signature we confirmed in our survey last month." Mr. Pruitt subsequently purchased this property independently, on his own assessment, before any external party had recognized its value. She did not look at Daniel when she said it. She did not need to. The room did. 43 people turned to look at the quiet man in the second row. Gary Sells was in the back of the room. Burl Mackey was not present, but 3 of his neighbors were, and they would tell him about it later, in detail, in the particular tone that people use when recounting something they wish they had seen differently from the start. Patrice Holden was in the third row, and she looked at her hands, and then at the screen, and then at her hands again. Maisie looked at none of them. She looked at her father's face. His expression did not change. His hands were in his lap, still. He was watching the formation map on the screen with the same focused attention he brought to everything. Creek banks, fence lines, ridge formations, the specific way his daughter's breathing sounded when she was asleep. The map was accurate. The numbers were correct. The name on the assessment was his. He had known all of it for 18 months, and the knowing had been, in itself, sufficient. The world catching up was not a victory. It was simply the inevitable conclusion of a true thing being true long enough. The water rights claim was formally validated by the board at 11:43 that morning. The county clerk, not Patrice Holden, a different clerk, younger, who had been watching the room with wide and careful eyes, entered Daniel Pruitt's name into the state water registry as the senior rights holder of record. His name, on the document, in the permanent record. He looked at Maisie. She was watching him with her mother's dark eyes, reading his face the way she read the thermometer, carefully, accurately, filing the result. She leaned close and said quietly, "Dad, is this the good part?" He said yes. This was the good part. She nodded and sat back and arranged Clover more securely on her lap, satisfied, as though the report was now complete. He was home before the light was gone. That was the thing he noticed first, pulling into the driveway at 4:30, with the sky still pale above the tree line, the day not yet finished, time remaining. It was not something he had planned. It was simply what happened when the thing you had been carrying for 18 months was finally set down, and you discovered that your hands were free earlier than expected. Maisie was in the kitchen doing her homework at the table. Clover propped against the fruit bowl in her customary supervisory position. She looked up when Daniel came in, assessed that nothing was wrong, and looked back at her worksheet. He hung his jacket on the hook by the door. He washed his hands. He opened the refrigerator and started making dinner. The chicken and rice he made most Thursday nights. The one Maisie would eat without negotiation. They ate without ceremony. Maisie told him that her teacher had asked the class to bring in something that represented where they were from, and she was thinking about bringing Clover, because Clover had been everywhere she had. Daniel said that was a good answer. She said she thought so too. After dinner he washed up and she dried, which was the arrangement they had arrived at some months ago without discussing it. She had simply picked up the dish towel one evening and started, and it had continued from there, the way most of their best arrangements had formed, through repetition rather than agreement. She went to brush her teeth. He sat at the kitchen table in the quiet. From the inside pocket of his jacket, hanging on the hook by the door, the folded survey pages made no sound. They had not changed. They were the same pages he had printed on the hallway inkjet 18 months ago, the same creases worn soft from being folded and unfolded, and carried and pressed against from the outside. Tomorrow he would take them out of the jacket pocket for the last time and put them in the drawer of the side table by the kitchen window. Not displayed, not framed, not made into anything larger than what they were. A record of a true thing, kept quietly, by the person who knew it first. Maisie came back from brushing her teeth, Clover under her arm, and stood in the kitchen doorway in her socks. She said, "Dad, did you know the whole time, or did you just have a feeling?" He looked at her. He looked at the jacket on the hook, the pocket where the pages were. He looked back at his daughter, 8 years old, dark eyes, one question containing everything the day had held, and everything the 18 months before it had held, and everything a quiet man carries when the world has decided not to look at him closely. He said, "Both." She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Then she said goodnight and went to bed, satisfied, as though both was a perfectly complete answer, which it was. Daniel sat for another moment in the kitchen. Then he reached over and turned off the light. Some men spend their lives being overlooked by a world that was standing on exactly what they knew.